The last thing I felt was the bite of the wind and the terrifying, bottomless emptiness of the sky. 15 years. 15 years of marriage, of building a life, of presiding over a corporate empire with the man who now looked down at me with eyes as cold and dead as the void beneath my feet. My husband, Julian Thorne, had just thrown my parachute out of the crippled plane and shoved me towards the open door. Now you understand, Alara. His voice was a flat, emotionless thing, stripped of even hatred. Now you know what true despair feels like. The force of the decompression snatched me into the roaring silence. The world became a whirlwind of screaming air and fragmented memories. Our wedding day, his distant smile. Countless anniversaries spent in polite, sterile companionship. The way he'd stand by the window of our penthouse, his thoughts a million miles away, always on her. Isabel. My sister. Or rather, the girl who had been raised as my sister while I, the true daughter of the Sterling family, was swapped at birth and raised in poverty. I had returned at 18, a disruption to their perfect, gilded world. Julian had loved Isabel with a desperate, obsessive passion. He'd been willing to give up his inheritance for her. But when she ran away and died in a conveniently timed accident, he had capitulated to his family's demands. He married me. I thought in time his icy exterior might thaw. I thought respect could be enough. I was a fool. As the ground rushed up to meet me, the final horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. It wasn't just indifference. It was a festering 15-year hatred. He had been waiting all this time for a moment like this. A moment where he could finally be free of me and avenge the woman he truly loved. The impact was a shattering of bone and consciousness. And then, nothing. A clink of fine china. The murmur of polite conversation. The scent of roasted duck and expensive perfume. I blinked, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was seated at a long mahogany dining table, gleaming under the soft glow of a crystal chandelier. My fingers were curled around a pair of ivory chopsticks, suspended over a plate of untouched food. I knew this place. I knew this moment. It was the engagement banquet. The night the Sterling and Thorne families officially announced my betrothal to Julian Thorne. My eyes swept across the table. There was my father, Alistair Sterling, his face a mask of patriarchal satisfaction. My mother, Eleanor, smiling nervously. Across from me sat Julian, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on his wine glass as if it held the answers to the universe. And beside him, looking heartbreakingly beautiful and fragile, was Isabel. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but she offered me a tremulous, forced smile. A wave of nausea, visceral and overwhelming, washed over me. It wasn't a dream. The searing pain of the fall, the cold finality in Julian's eyes. It was all too real, branded onto my soul. I had lived it. I had died from it. And now I was back. 15 years of my life, erased in an instant. A second chance handed to me by some cosmic fluke. The conversation buzzed around me, but I heard none of it. I was trapped in the echo of Julian's last words to me. Now you know what true despair feels like. Despair? Well, what I felt now was a cold, sharp clarity. Despair was for the woman I had been. The woman who tried to reason, to plead, to earn a love that was never meant for hers. The woman who fell from the sky believing she was the villain in someone else's tragedy. I was not that woman anymore. I slowly, deliberately set my chopsticks down on the porcelain rest. The soft click seemed to reverberate through the room, drawing every eye to me. I turned to my grandfather, Arthur Thorne, the formidable patriarch of the Thorne family. His sharp, intelligent eyes met mine and I saw a flicker of curiosity there. "Grandfather Arthur," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the polite chatter. It was the voice of Alara Sterling Sion-waiting, not the frightened girl they all expected. "I have a request." Julian's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. Isabel froze, a forkful of food halfway to her lips. "What is it, my dear?" Arthur's voice was a low rumble. I took a shallow breath, my gaze sweeping from Julian's suspicious face to Isabel's pleading one. "Please," I said, the word feeling like a key turning in a lock, "allow Julian to marry Isabel." A stunned silence swallowed the room. You could have heard a petal drop from the floral centerpiece. "Ilara," my mother gasped. Julian was staring at me as if I'd sprouted a second head. Confusion, suspicion, and a tiny, treacherous spark of hope warred in his expression. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice tight. I kept my eyes on Arthur Thorne. "They're in love." Everyone knows it. My return has complicated things. It wouldn't be right for me to take her place in this too. I allowed a note of gentle resignation to color my tone. I don't wish to be the obstacle to their happiness. Isabel's face was a canvas of shock. She hadn't expected this. In the previous timeline, I had fought for this engagement, believing it was my duty, my right. I had tried to gently explain to Julian that Isabel was only with him for his status and his access to a rare mythical text in his private library. He hadn't listened. He never did. Now I was giving him exactly what he thought he wanted. Arthur Thorne studied me, his gaze piercing. He was a man who valued bloodlines and legacy above all else. Isabel was an imposter, a cuckoo in the Sterling nest. Marrying her brought no strategic advantage. The engagement between the Thornes and Sterlings is a matter of business, Elara, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. It ensures the future of both our corporations. I nodded respectfully. I understand that, grandfather. And I am a Sterling. My commitment to our family's future is absolute. But a marriage built on reluctance is a weak foundation for such an important alliance. There are other ways to secure our interests. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not agreement but a dawning respect for my audacity. He had expected a docile heiress, grateful for her reinstatement. He was not getting one. The banquet dissolved into a hushed, frantic buzz. My father was furious, my mother was confused, and Julian was watching me with an unreadable expression. But it was Isabel's gaze I felt most keenly. She was looking at me not with gratitude, but with a calculating, wary intensity. She knew a gift horse when she saw one, and she was immediately suspicious of its teeth. As the party broke up, Julian cornered me in the hall, his hand closing around my wrist. His touch was like ice, just as it had been in the plane. "What game are you playing, Elara?" he hissed, his face close to mine. I looked down at his hand, then back up at him, my expression utterly blank. "No game, Julian. I'm simply giving you what you've always wanted. You should be thanking me." "I don't trust you," he spat. "You've been back for 3 months. You've done nothing but disrupt everything. Why would you do this now?" I smiled, then a small cold curve of my lips that didn't reach my eyes. It was the smile of a woman who had seen the end of her own story and had been granted a rewrite. "Because," I said, gently pulling my wrist from his grasp, "I've realized I don't want the leftovers of another woman's affection. You and Isabel deserve each other." I turned and walked away, the click of my heels on the marble floor a steady, confident rhythm. The first move had been made. The board was set. And this time I was not a pawn to be sacrificed. I was the player. And I knew something Julian, in all his self-absorbed arrogance, did not. Isabel didn't love him. He never had. The man she truly wanted, the man she had been trying to get close to through Julian all along, was his uncle, Lysander Thorne. The real power behind the Thorne Empire, and the man Julian feared most in the world. The game was indeed afoot, but the prize was no longer Julian Thorne's hollow heart. It was survival. It was victory. It was making sure that when I fell this time I would be the one holding the parachute. The days following the banquet were a whirlwind of quiet chaos. The Thorne and Sterling elders went into closed-door meetings, their voices a low, urgent hum behind polished oak doors. The news didn't break publicly. Families like ours handled our scandals with the discretion of a state secret. But within our gilded circles the gossip was wildfire. Elara Sterling, the long-lost true heir, had rejected the Golden Prince, Julian Thorne. And she had offered him like an unwanted trinket to the imposter sister. I stayed in my penthouse apartment, a sterile, beautiful cage my parents had provided upon my return. I ignored the frantic calls from my mother and the thinly veiled threats from my father. I spent my days reviewing Carter Corporation financials, a right I had claimed as my birthright. I was no longer the girl trying to fit in. I was the heir preparing for a takeover. It was Julian who broke the silence first. He summoned me to dinner. Not a request. Summons. I almost laughed. The arrogance was breathtaking even now. He still saw himself as the sun around which my world revolved. I agreed, not out of obedience but out of a sense of morbid curiosity. I wanted to see the puppet show up close. The restaurant was opulently private, a place where deals were made and mistresses were kept. Julian was already there, seated at a prime table, looking devastatingly handsome and utterly miserable. And beside him, of course, was Isabel. She was a vision in soft pink, her hand resting possessively on Julian's arm. Her eyes, however, held a familiar, calculating gleam. "Elara," Julian began, his tone attempting to be conciliatory but landing on condescending. "We need to talk about this situation." I simply raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of my water. "What situation is that?" "This ridiculous notion of you giving up the engagement," he said, leaning forward. "I know you're trying to be noble, or perhaps you're hurt. But this isn't how things are done." Isabel chimed in, her voice a saccharine melody. "We're so worried about you, Elara. You've been through so much. Coming home to all this pressure. It must be overwhelming." She placed a hand over her heart, a picture of sisterly concern. "Julian and we love each other, it's true. But you have everything now. You're the true sterling heir. Could you let me have him? I promise I'll spend my whole life repaying your kindness." It was a perfect performance. The selfless lover, the victim of circumstance. In my first life, this act had filled me with a confused sense of guilt. Now I saw the strings. He was panicking. With me back in the picture, her value had plummeted. Marrying Julian was her only chance to maintain her status, to get revenge on me for usurping her life, and to stay close to the Thorn power structure, and to Lysander. I set my glass down with a quiet click. "You misunderstand me, both of you," I said, my voice flat. "This isn't an act of generosity. It's a matter of taste." Julian's face tightened. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," I said, picking up my menu, "that I have no interest in marrying a man who is so easily manipulated. It's bad for business." Isabel's facade cracked for a second, a flash of pure venom in her eyes before it was replaced by wounded tears. "How can you be so cruel? After everything our family has done for you." "Our family," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "You mean the family you were fraudulently passed into? The family I was stolen from?" The color drained from her face. Julian slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. "That's enough, Elara. She is as much a victim in this as you are." "Is she?" I asked, my gaze locking with his. "Tell me, Julian, does a victim fight so desperately to keep the spoils of her deception?" I let the question hang between us, watching the confusion and anger war in his eyes. He was so blind. He saw her tears and believed them to be pearls when they were merely glass. "You have no idea what you're throwing away," he said, his voice dropping to a low, furious whisper. "The alliance between our families is the only thing propping up the Carter Corporation. Without the Thorn name, you'll be bankrupt in a year." It was the same threat he'd used in my previous life. Then it had terrified me. Now it was just noise. "Then I suppose I'll have to find a way to manage," I said, my tone bored. "Now if you'll excuse me, this conversation is a waste of my time. I have a company to run." I stood to leave, but Julian stood with me, blocking my path. "You think you're so clever? You're nothing but a backstreet urchin who got lucky. You have no class, no grace. If it were Isabel in your position, she would never be so selfish." I looked at him, this man I had been bound to for 15 years, this man who had murdered me, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not hurt. Just a vast, echoing emptiness. "Then it's a good thing she's not in my position," I said softly. "And an even better thing that I no longer want to be in yours." I walked away from the table, from their stunned silence. I didn't look back. The dinner had achieved exactly what I'd hoped. I had drawn my line in the sand. The battle lines were now clear. A few days later, I received another summons. This one was from Arthur Thorn himself. An invitation to a family dinner at the Thorn Manor. This was it. The real test. The Thorn Manor was a monument to old money and cold power. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow you. The family was all there. Julian's parents, a few aunts and uncles, and Julian himself, glowering in a corner. And then I saw him. Lysander Thorn. He stood apart from the others, near the grand fireplace, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He was younger than his brother Julian's father, but he carried an aura of authority that made everyone else in the room seem like a background extra. He was impeccably dressed, his features sharp and intelligent, his gaze detached, observing the room as if it were a mildly interesting specimen under glass. In my first life I had barely spoken to him. He was a ghost in the corporate machinery, a rumor of formidable intellect and chilling ruthlessness. Arthur Thorne presided over the dinner table like a king. He was especially kind to me, his usual stern demeanor softening. "Elara, my child," he said, his voice warm. "I know this world has been thrust upon you. You should have grown up surrounded by luxury and protection, not struggle. I've been thinking, you don't need property or jewelry. You'll have plenty of that. So my gift to you is this: 3 wishes." A hushed silence fell over the table. Julian looked like he'd been slapped. "As long as I am alive," Arthur continued, his eyes holding mine, "no matter what you ask of me, I will grant it." It was an unprecedented show of favor. I knew it was because I was the spitting image of his late wife in her youth, a ghost he had never stopped mourning. I should have felt grateful. But all I felt was the weight of the opportunity. I couldn't waste this on petty revenge. I had to use it to secure my future, to break the cycle. I put down my dessert fork and turned to him, my expression solemn. "Grandfather Arthur," I said, my voice clear and carrying in the silent room. "Thank you for your incredible kindness. There is one thing I want more than anything else." Julian was staring at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of panic and fury. He knew what was coming. "Please," I said, "allow Julian to marry Isabel. Let them be happy. I am the one who came in and turned their world upside down. If I also take the man she loves, I will never have a moment's peace. Besides," I added, looking directly at Julian, "I don't love him. A marriage without love is a prison for both people." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the ice melting in Lysander's glass. Arthur Thorne's face was unreadable, a granite mask. Julian looked utterly betrayed, as if I had stolen something from him, even though I was giving him his heart's desire. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The barest, most fleeting upturn at the corner of Lysander Thorne's mouth. A ghost of a smile, there and gone in an instant. It was all the confirmation I needed. Arthur finally nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture. "If that is your wish, then it shall be so." The engagement was officially broken. Of course, the Thornes wouldn't announce it. Discretion was everything. But I took it upon myself to tell Isabel. "I've asked the Thorne elders to cancel my engagement to Julian," I told her over the phone. "The rest is up to you." She didn't waste a second. She couldn't bear the thought of her fairy tale ending, so she hired an online army. The story spread like a virus. The narrative was perfect. Isabel, the tragic heroine, fighting against cruel, elitist families for her true love. Netizens crowned her a love warrior. Public opinion turned violently against the Thornes and Sterlings for being heartless, money-grubbing snobs. The stock of Thorne Global took a hit. Julian was brutally scolded by his father, who told him in no uncertain terms that business was more important than women, and that he should have just married me and kept Isabel as a mistress. But the damage was done. The court of public opinion had spoken. And I had set the stage for my next move. I had freed myself from Julian, exposed Isabel's desperation, and thrown the Thorne empire into chaos. Now it was time to find an ally in the wreckage. It was time to approach the one man who understood power, and who had just seen me wield mine with devastating effect. It was time to talk to Lysander. The fallout from the broken engagement was a symphony played in the key of Schadenfreude, and I had the best seat in the house. Isabel, emboldened by her online fame, was everywhere, giving tearful interviews, posting loving tributes to Julian, painting herself as a modern-day Cinderella battling wicked step-relatives. The Thorne family was furious, their public image tarnished. Julian, caught between his family's wrath and his girlfriend's very public victory, became a sullen, brooding presence. He tried to confront me once, storming into my office at Carter Corporation. "Elara," he'd snarled, his composure shattered. "Since when did you start conspiring with my uncle?" I looked up from the quarterly reports, utterly unimpressed. "I'm sorry, which uncle would that be? You'll have to be more specific. Your family tree is somewhat tangled." His face flushed a mottled red. "Lysander, I always thought you were cold, but I never took you for a scheming, manipulative—" "Careful, Julian," I interrupted, my voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "I am now your uncle's fiancé. By seniority you should be calling me Aunt Elara. I imagine Grandfather Arthur would be quite pleased to hear you show me such respect." The look on his face was worth every second of the 15-year hell he'd put me through. It was a beautiful cocktail of rage, humiliation, and dawning horror. He was realizing far too late that he had not only lost a pawn, but gained a rival with a superior position on the board. "You get to marry Isabel," I continued sweetly. "The woman you've been pining for all these years. Isn't that what you've always wanted?" He left without another word, but the hatred in his eyes was a tangible thing. It was fine. Hatred I could work with. It was his cold, detached pity that had killed me. My engagement to Lysander had been my masterstroke. After the family dinner, I had requested a meeting with him. He'd agreed with an air of detached curiosity. We met in a private lounge, a space that felt more like a library than a bar, all dark wood and the scent of old books and fine whiskey. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You want to use me to get back at my nephew?" It wasn't a question. I appreciated his directness. "It's not entirely about revenge," I'd replied, matching his tone. "Mostly it's a strategic alliance. You need a wife to appease your father and solidify your claim to Thorn Global. I need a husband who isn't in love with my sister and who won't try to push me out of a plane." A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, crossed his impassive features. The plane comment was a risk, but I needed to establish that I was operating on a different level. "I know you're not interested in women," I continued bluntly. "That works for me. I'm not looking for love. I'm looking for a partner. In exchange for this marriage, I'll help you take control of Thorn Global." He'd studied me for a long, silent moment, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. He was weighing my words, my motives, the sheer audacity of my proposal. "You have a startling lack of sentimentality," he'd observed finally. "Sentimentality is a luxury I can't afford," I said. "It gets you killed." He'd agreed. Just like that. The marriage would serve both our purposes. For my part, I knew that in my first life after Arthur's death, it was Lysander who had emerged from the shadows to ruthlessly seize control of the company. He was the true power. Aligning with him wasn't just a survival tactic. It was an investment in the winning side. Our engagement was announced discreetly, but the effect was seismic. The city's elite were stunned. The narrative flipped overnight. I was no longer the jilted fiancé. I was the brilliant strategist who had landed the most elusive and powerful bachelor in the city. Jacob bought out every billboard with a simple, elegant declaration, and even had a pink heart drawn in the sky by a squadron of planes. It was a display of power and romance that completely overshadowed Isabel and Julian's tawdry online saga. Grandfather Arthur, seeing that a union with me was still possible and that it would bind his most capable son to the family, gave his blessing. He saw the logic. Julian had proven himself impulsive and led by his heart. Lysander was cold, calculating, and brilliant. Marrying him to the sterling heir was a masterstroke. Julian, in a fit of pique and desperate to prove himself, volunteered to go overseas to close a billion-dollar deal. He took Isabel with him, no doubt imagining a triumphant return that would restore his tarnished glory. He was gone for a month. The negotiations stalled, the other party throwing up endless excuses. Meanwhile, Lysander was a whirlwind of activity at Thorn Global. He gathered allies, secured the loyalty of key shareholders, and implemented strategies that showed immediate results. He came home for dinner every night. Our arrangement was surprisingly comfortable. He was thoughtful, intelligent, and respected my space and my work. On weekends he even cooked, his culinary skills as precise and flawless as his business strategies. He knew all my preferences, how I liked my coffee, that I hated the sound of people chewing, my fondness for obscure classical music. One evening, after a particularly exquisite meal he'd prepared, I teased him. "You seem to know my likes and dislikes a little too well. You're not secretly in love with me, are you?" He was pouring a glass of wine, his movements fluid and controlled. He didn't look at me, but I saw the very tips of his ears turn a faint shade of pink. "Isn't it a husband's duty to understand what his wife enjoys?" he replied, his voice as level as ever. I chuckled. The great Lysander Thorn, blushing. It was a revelation. Julian, on the other hand, was failing spectacularly. When Isabel complained that the foreign winters were too cold, he abandoned the billion-dollar contract and brought her home. The shareholders were apoplectic. His foolish, lovesick act was the final nail in his coffin. Major investors pulled their support and flocked to Lysander. The day they returned, Julian looked haggard and defeated. He finally understood the value of what he'd lost. Marrying me would have given him the sterling empire as a backbone. Marrying Isabel had given him nothing but debt and ridicule. Frustrated with his failures, he began to neglect her. And Isabel, ever the opportunist, realized her meal ticket was crumbling. So she did what she did best. She set her sights on a bigger prize. It started with small things. Brushing against Lysander when she passed him a dish. Pretending to feel faint and accidentally collapsing toward him. I saw the clear disdain in his eyes when it happened, but he still caught her, his reflexes automatic. I said nothing, but a cold anger began to simmer inside me. This was my territory now. My life. My alliance. He would not poison this one too. It all came to a head one night. I was reading in the living room when I saw Isabel, wearing a silk negligee so sheer it left nothing to the imagination, slink down the hallway and knock softly on the door to Lysander's study. I waited a moment, my blood running cold. Then I followed. I pushed the door open without knocking. The scene was exactly as I'd feared, yet somehow more pathetic. Isabel was on her knees before his desk, her face tilted up, tears glistening in her eyes. Lysander was seated in his high-backed leather chair, looking down at her with an expression of utter, profound boredom, as if she were a mildly irritating insect. They both froze when they saw me. Isabel had the audacity to look embarrassed for a second before her eyes hardened with defiance. Lysander's gaze met mine, and I saw a flicker of something, apology? Amusement. Before his usual mask of detachment slid back into place. Rage, white-hot and blinding, consumed me. I marched forward, grabbed Isabel by her hair and yanked her to her feet. Then I slapped her. Hard. The crack echoed in the quiet study. What? I snarled. You think I'm dead? Julian's failing, so you're already shopping for his replacement. She clutched her cheek, her eyes wide with shock and hatred. Why do you get to have him? She spat, her voice trembling with fury. If you were supposed to die out there, you should have stayed dead. I'm the one who should have married him. She was unraveling, the pressure of her crumbling world finally cracking her perfect facade. Go ahead, she sneered, picking up her robe from the floor. Tell the family elders. What proof do you have? I'll never admit to it. I'll say he forced himself on me. See who they believe. With a toss of her hair, she stormed out, leaving me standing there, trembling with adrenaline and fury. Of course, I wouldn't go to Arthur. Airing the family's dirty laundry was a losing strategy. But just looking at Lysander, so calm and unmoved, infuriated me. He'd let it happen. He'd allowed her to get this far. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, his hand shot out and closed around my wrist. He pulled me toward him, and before I could process what was happening, I was sitting on his lap, caged in his arms. He smelled of sandalwood and old books. Were you jealous just now? He asked, his voice a low murmur near my ear. I tried to shove him away, but his grip was like iron. Don't flatter yourself, I snapped, turning my face away. I just don't like people touching my things. I knew he didn't care for her. If he had, she would have succeeded in seducing him in our first life. But I was still mad. He'd seen her game and hadn't shut it down, using her as a pawn to gauge my reaction. He gently pinched my chin and turned my face back to his, forcing me to meet his gaze. His eyes, usually so cold and distant, were now burning with an intensity that stole my breath. I admit it, he said quietly. I did it on purpose. I wanted to see how you'd react. I wanted to know if you cared. I stared at him, utterly confused. The logic was so alien, so human. He looked at me with a startling vulnerability. Alara Sterling, I like you. But you're so calm, so rational. I just wanted to know if you'd get jealous. If I mattered to you. The confession hung in the air between us, shattering every assumption I had about our arrangement. He wasn't a detached monk. He was a man. A man who, for reasons I couldn't fathom, had developed feelings for me. Without thinking, driven by a surge of emotion I didn't understand, I leaned forward and pressed my lips to the corner of his mouth. It was a quick, impulsive touch. I pulled back, my heart hammering. Well, I whispered. Do you know now? He touched the spot where my lips had been, his ears turning a brilliant red. Then without a word he cupped the back of my head and kissed me. It wasn't gentle or practiced. It was awkward, forceful, and overwhelmingly possessive. His breath was hot, his presence absolute. He didn't give me a chance to resist. When he finally broke the kiss, we were both breathless. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, his breathing ragged. "From now on," he murmured against my skin, his voice rough, "I'm moving back into the master bedroom. I'm done sleeping in the study." The game had just changed. And for the first time since I'd fallen from that plane, I felt truly, terrifyingly alive. The dynamic between Lysander and me shifted that night. The careful, contractual boundaries of our marriage blurred into something far more complex and unpredictable. He moved his things into the master bedroom, and our chaste coexistence became a shared space charged with a new, unspoken tension. He was still reserved, still controlled, but now his touches were deliberate. A hand on the small of my back as I passed, his fingers brushing mine when he handed me a coffee. It was a silent, persistent claim. I didn't know how to feel about it. My entire second life had been built on the foundation of cold, hard strategy. Emotions were a vulnerability I couldn't afford. Yet the memory of that kiss, the raw vulnerability in his eyes when he admitted he liked me, it was a crack in my own armor. I found myself watching him, studying the curve of his mouth when he was deep in thought, the way his brow furrowed slightly when he read the morning news. It was disconcerting. This newfound whatever it was immediately tested. Julian returned from his failed business trip a changed man. The arrogance was still there, but it was brittle, underpinned by a frantic desperation. The shareholders were abandoning him in droves, and he could feel his birthright slipping through his fingers. Isabel, ever the opportunist, was the first to stir up trouble. She played the victim to perfection, running to Julian with a tale of how I had not only humiliated her but physically assaulted her. She showed him the faint, long-faded mark on her cheek, a masterpiece of makeup and manipulation. Julian, needing an outlet for his own failures, came rushing to me, his face a thundercloud. "I've never seen a woman as vicious as you," he snarled, cornering me in the hallway of the Thorn Manor. "The Sterlings raised her for over 20 years. Your parents didn't even kick her out when you came back. Why do you insist on making her life a living hell?" I leaned against the wall, crossing my arms. I wasn't even angry. I was bored. "Is that the story she's spinning now? That I'm the bully?" "She's family," he shouted, his voice echoing in the vast space. "No, Julian," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "She is the daughter of the nurse who stole me. She is the beneficiary of a crime. The only reason she's still here is because my parents have a softer heart than I do." His lip curled in a sneer. "I seriously don't get what my uncle sees in you. He's always been so cold, so above it all. And yet he's willing to marry someone like you. You're disgusting. Absolutely shameless." I laughed. I couldn't help it. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "Instead of wasting your time yelling at me, Julian, why don't you keep a closer eye on your sweet, innocent fiancé? You're so oblivious, your head's already covered in green and you don't even realize it. Keep parading her around like a trophy, and you're going to be the laughingstock of this entire city. A man's pride is his most fragile possession." My words hit their mark with the precision of a scalpel. His face turned purple with rage. "You lying bitch," he roared and lunged forward, his hand raised to strike me. I didn't flinch. I'd faced worse from him. But the blow never landed. A hand shot out and caught Julian's wrist mid-air, stopping it with an iron grip. Lysander stood beside us, his presence like a sudden drop in temperature. His eyes were chips of ice, his voice lethally calm. "Is this how you treat your aunt?" he asked, his gaze boring into Julian. "Is this the kind of respect your parents taught you? If you don't understand manners, I'd be more than happy to teach you on their behalf." Julian withered under his uncle's gaze. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a sullen, cowed fear. He mumbled something unintelligible, yanked his arm free and slunk away, tail between his legs. Lysander turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Are you all right?" "I've survived worse," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He studied me for a long moment, a question in his eyes, but he didn't press it. He simply nodded. "Let's go home." Home. The word felt strange. My apartment had never been a home. The Thorn Manor was a battlefield. But the penthouse I now shared with Lysander, it was starting to feel like something else. A sanctuary, perhaps. Or just a more gilded cage. I wasn't sure yet. Julian's position within Thorn Global became increasingly precarious. His string of failures had not only damaged the company's bottom line but had shattered the confidence of those who had backed him as the future leader. More and more of the senior members, pragmatic to their core, began to shift their allegiance to Lysander. He was capable, decisive, and his results were undeniable. I watched it all from my dual positions as CEO of Sterling Corp and the wife of the rising power. I was no longer a spectator. I was an active player, feeding Lysander information, helping him strategize, using my knowledge of the future to steer him away from potential pitfalls. We were a team. A real one. Julian, drowning in pressure and feeling the walls close in, made a desperate last-ditch attempt to secure his position. He thought that if he couldn't offer power or competence, he could at least offer an heir. At a family gathering with all the key players present, he and Isabel stood up and proudly announced that she was pregnant. A ripple of surprise, then forced congratulations moved through the room. Grandfather Arthur's face was a careful mask, but I saw the slight tightening around his eyes. An heir complicated things. I, however, was thrilled. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I walked over to the glowing couple, a smile playing on my lips. "Congratulations," I said, my voice dripping with faux sweetness. "So, is this a real pregnancy or a fake one?" Julian's face darkened instantly. "Why would we lie about something like this?" he snapped. Isabel placed a protective hand on her still flat belly, her face a masterpiece of maternal radiance. "Julian, don't argue with my sister," she said sweetly. "We're younger. Maybe we moved a bit fast and made them feel pressured. But it's a good thing for Grandpa to get to hold his great-grandchild in this lifetime." She turned her saccharine smile to me. "Ilara, you shouldn't take it to heart." "Why would I?" I smiled back. "I'm thrilled. Honestly, watching you dig your own graves is far more entertaining than doing it myself." I leaned a little closer, lowering my voice so only they could hear. "A few words from me and you'll be crying on your knees in no time." I saw the flicker of panic in Isabel's eyes before she could hide it. "I get it," I went on, my gaze shifting to Julian. "You're losing ground in the company and desperate not to be pushed out. So you're pulling all-nighters, just not to work but to make a baby. Dozens of billions are at stake. But unlike you two, Lysander and I have actual ability. We don't need children to boost our head count." Their faces were masks of fury. I had struck a nerve. Then I dropped the bomb. The one piece of information from my first life that would unravel everything. "I suggest you get a fertility test, Julian," I said coolly. "Don't spend your own money raising someone else's child." The blood drained from Julian's face. Isabel looked like a deer caught in headlights, her carefully constructed composure shattering into a million pieces. The child wasn't his. In my first life, Julian and I were married for 15 years and never had a single child. After countless tests and specialists, we discovered the problem was with him. He was infertile. In the stunned silence, Julian naturally assumed I was just being vicious, lashing out in jealousy. But I saw the seed of doubt take root in his mind. It was there, in the way his eyes darted to Isabel's stomach, in the slight tremor in his hand. He shouted something at me, a denial, a curse, but I was already walking away, linking my arm with Lysander's. "What was that about?" he murmured as he led me away. "Just speeding up the inevitable," I replied. The seed I had planted grew. As Isabel's belly began to show, the doubt must have festered in Julian's mind, poisoning whatever was left of their great love. He finally went for a secret checkup. The result: infertility. The news, when it reached me, was delivered with dry amusement by Lysander. "It seems your prediction was correct. Julian got his results today. He's apparently sterile." I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. "And how did he take the news?" "He fainted. They admitted him to the hospital for stress." I couldn't help the small, cold smile that touched my lips. How unfortunate. Those few days while Julian was hospitalized were blissfully peaceful. But when he was discharged and returned to the family fold, I noticed a profound change in him. The desperate anger was gone, replaced by a deep, world-weary exhaustion. He moved differently, carried himself with the heavy weight of a man who had seen too much. He looked older. He looked exactly like he had in his 40s in my previous life. My instincts screamed a warning. This wasn't just the shock of the diagnosis. He cornered me one evening at the manor, his eyes haunted. "Ilara," he said, his voice raspy. "I was wrong. Please forgive me." The words were like a bucket of ice water. This wasn't the Julian of this timeline. This was the Julian from the end of my first life. You still like me, don't you? He continued, a desperate hope in his eyes. Otherwise, why would you tell me the child isn't mine? If you want, I can divorce her right now. I stared at him, my blood running cold. He had remembered. He had been reborn. The game had just become infinitely more dangerous. The world tilted on its axis. Julian was back. Not the arrogant, foolish boy of this timeline, but the man from the end of our first life. The man who had watched me fall. The knowledge was a cold knot in my stomach. All my advantages, my foresight, were now halved. He knew what I knew. I schooled my features into a mask of cold disdain, hiding the turmoil inside. Forgive you. I repeated, my voice laced with scorn. You humiliated me over and over for Isabel. If I were to forgive you just because you say a few sweet words, wouldn't that make me look weak? Desperate? I'm the CEO of Sterling Corp., not some lovesick puppy. Don't I deserve a little pride? I was playing a dangerous game, feeding the narrative of the scorned woman, hoping he would cling to that simpler explanation rather than suspecting I, too, remembered everything. Seeing my apparent wavering, he relaxed slightly, a familiar, calculating gleam returning to his eyes. This was the Julian I knew, always looking for the angle. Then what do you want? He asked, stepping closer. Just tell me what will make you happy. I'll do anything. I raised an eyebrow, feigning consideration. Anything. I let the word hang between us. Even if it involves Isabel? You already know I hate her, I said, layering my voice with a convincing tremor of old pain. She took my family, stole my place, enjoyed my luxury, and even stole you. I forced the next words out as if they were a painful confession. I want you to expose her. Publicly. Her cheating, her manipulations, the fact that she's pregnant with another man's child. I want the whole world to see what kind of person she really is. He went silent, his mind clearly racing, weighing the cost. I could see him thinking, this is manageable. This is a price I can pay. I tilted my head, watching him carefully. You know, in all this you might actually be the biggest victim. But judging by the look on your face, are you still not over her? I paused, letting the barb sink in. Of course, if you're still emotionally attached, if you don't want to be torn apart online, I'll respect that. I won't push you. But looking at the way you are now, how could I ever marry someone like you? Let's just forget it. The threat of me withdrawing my forgiveness was the final push he needed. Panic flashed across his face. He grabbed my wrist, his grip tight. I'll make sure she's completely ruined. I promise. I pulled my hand away as if burned. I'll be watching. That night I told Lysander everything. Well, almost everything. I told him about Julian's sudden change of heart, his confession, and the deal I had struck. I didn't mention the rebirth. Some truths were too fantastical, too fragile to speak aloud. He listened in silence, his expression grim. When I finished, he frowned, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. You really have that little faith in your husband? He asked, his tone slightly sarcastic. You want my father to see his true colors and kick him out of the family? You should have just told me. I'll take care of it. I guarantee you'll be satisfied. He was no longer the cold, unreadable statue. He was showing his emotions, his possessiveness, his desire to protect what was his. It was disarming. I found myself wanting to trust him, to lean on this newfound strength. I reached out and pinched his cheek, a playful gesture to mask my own unease. Let me play with him a little, I teased. It's only fun if I'm the one in control. He caught my hand, his gaze softening. As you wish. Julian, for his part, was ruthless. He crafted a masterful online persona, the loyal, heartbroken man betrayed by the woman he loved. He unleashed a digital storm against Isabel, post after post, each one sharp, direct, and brutally honest. He revealed texts, hinted at her infidelities, and finally, presented his medical records as proof that the child could not be his. The internet, which had once crowned her a love warrior, now turned on her with the same ferocity. She was labeled a gold digger, a manipulative whore. The sympathy for Julian was universal. He played the victim to perfection. I watched it all from the sidelines, a cold satisfaction settling in my bones. This was the man who, on his deathbed in my first life, had whispered Isabel's name. Now he was destroying her without a second thought. There was no loyalty in him, only a consuming self-interest. The Carter Corporation officially severed all ties with Isabel, disowning her publicly. Julian, cunning to the end, hid the full extent of his own manipulations and emerged from the divorce squeaky clean, the wronged party. Isabel was left with nothing. Not a cent. She was devastated and terrified. She refused to sign the divorce papers, begging Julian not to cast her out. But he was done. In a final ugly confrontation at the Thorne Manor, which I observed from a discreet distance, he slapped her so hard she fell to the floor. "Olivia Chin," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You betrayed me and I haven't even demanded compensation. I've shown you more mercy than you deserve." Then he glanced over at me, a performative look of regret on his face. "But I guess this is what I get for being blind, passing up the woman who truly loved me for someone as fake and disloyal as you. It was a show for my benefit and we both knew it." In that moment something in Isabel seemed to break. She turned, saw me watching and in a shocking move, scrambled across the floor on her knees and grabbed the hem of my dress. "Elara," she sobbed, her face a mess of tears and smeared makeup. "I was wrong. Grandpa loves you the most. Please help me. Just ask him to let me stay. If you help me this once, I swear I'll behave. I won't cause trouble anymore." She was backed into a corner, her pride completely shattered. But I wasn't a saint. I felt no pity, only a distant revulsion. "This is between the two of you," I said calmly, pulling my dress from her grasp. "I may be a senior in name, but it's not my place to meddle. You'll have to settle it yourselves." I added for good measure, "Grandfather's health hasn't been great lately. We should keep this from him. If he hears about it and it makes his condition worse, we'll all regret it." It was the final nail in her coffin. A greedy, desperate glint sparked in Julian's eyes. He couldn't risk Arthur's displeasure now. Without another word, he ordered the bodyguards to pin a screaming, crying Isabel down and forced her hand to sign the divorce papers. Her belongings were tossed out of the Thorne estate like garbage and she was dumped at the gates. It was over. With Isabel gone, Julian turned all his attention to me. He began a relentless campaign, pushing me to divorce Lysander and marry him. He was desperate, seeing his chance to reclaim the future he remembered. A future where, with me by his side, he had inherited Thorne Global. "You don't need to take care of Grandpa," he insisted one day, cornering me in the corporate lobby. "I can hire private nurses. Besides, with all the bad press, Thorne Global could use some good news. A wedding might even improve his health. You know, like in the old days, a joyous event to drive away misfortune." The sheer audacity of his logic was astounding. "Let me get this straight," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "I should divorce your uncle and then marry you? Did you really think Grandfather would be happy about that?" His smile faltered. "Why are you in such a rush to marry me? What's really in it for you?" He tried to recover, putting on a facade of deep affection. "Isn't it obvious? I love you." I let out a cold chuckle. "You don't love me." I looked him dead in the eye, deciding to push him to see how much he really remembered. "You were reborn too, weren't you?" His pupils dilated, his face going pale. He was stunned into silence. "That's right," I said calmly. "I was reborn. This time I'm letting you go. But too bad. Isabel doesn't love you. I've been thinking about this my whole life, but it ends up as just another first ending. Thorne Global is too big and you're simply not capable. If you tried running it, bankruptcy would be inevitable." He fell silent, the truth finally laid bare between us. He had believed he could use his memories to manipulate me, to win my sympathy with the ghost of our shared past. But after the crash, his final gaze and words had cut too deep. I felt no compassion for him now. Only a cold determination to ensure his downfall was permanent. It was time to end this. I set a final, decisive plan in motion. The final act of our tragedy required a grand stage. I chose the hospital where Arthur Thorne was being treated for a minor, but concerning heart condition. With the help of a doctor who was loyal to Lysander, and a significant financial incentive, I arranged a performance. The doctor called Julian with a voice full of grave urgency. Arthur Thorne had taken a sudden turn for the worse. Despite the best efforts of the medical team, he had passed away. Julian arrived at the hospital in a frenzy, his face a poorly constructed mask of grief. But I saw it, the unmistakable glint of gold in his eyes. This was his moment. With Arthur gone, the path to the throne was clear and he believed I was the key to unlocking it. He found me sitting in the private waiting room, my head bowed. I had practiced my silent tears in the mirror. "Elara," he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper as he sat beside me. He placed a hand on my shoulder and I had to suppress a shudder. "I know this is hard for you. It's hard for me. But now more than ever we have to stay strong." I didn't look up, letting a single perfect tear trace a path down my cheek. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my ear. "Grandpa passed so suddenly. Did he leave a will? Who's taking over the company? And how will his estate be divided?" That was my cue. I shoved his hand off my shoulder and looked up, my eyes flashing with cold fury. "Grandpa just died," I snapped, my voice cracking with what he would mistake for grief. "His body is still warm and all you care about is his money? His assets were his to give to whomever he pleased. I respect his decisions." His mask shattered. Rage, pure and unadulterated, erupted from him. He grabbed me and hauled me off the sofa, his fingers digging into my arms. "Did Grandpa leave the company to Lysander?" he shouted, his face contorted. "So what if he did?" I shot back, throwing his own future words back at him. "The Thorn Corporation is mine. Grandpa never liked Lysander. He blamed him for Grandma's death. You're telling me Grandpa gave him the company? That's not possible." He was unraveling just as I'd hoped. The man who had been reborn with all the knowledge of his future failures was now watching it happen all over again, and he was breaking. Then, in a move of sheer, pathetic desperation, he dropped to his knees. "Auntie," he pleaded, his voice softening into a sickeningly sweet tone. "Please help me, okay? Grandpa's gone now anyway. You were the last person to see him. Just tell the company that Grandpa named me as the successor. Everyone knows how much Grandpa adored you. With your support, I'm confident I can defeat Uncle Jacob and lead the Thorn Corporation to new heights." He was groveling. The great Julian Thorn on his knees. The sight was so satisfying it was almost poetic. "If you help me," he continued, his eyes gleaming with avarice, "once I'm in charge I'll transfer 10% of the company's shares to you as payment." I looked down at him, at the pathetic, grasping creature he had become. All the pain, the betrayal, the 15 years of loneliness and the final terrifying fall. It all crystallized into a single clear moment of contempt. I spat in his face. The saliva landed on his cheek, a small wet mark of my utter disdain. He recoiled, stunned. "No thanks," I said, my voice colder than the void I had fallen into. "You're not even that capable. Your ambition is massive. I already own all of Sterling Corporation. I'm not interested in your measly 10%. There's no way I'd help you fool everyone." He wiped the spit from his face, his expression darkening into something truly monstrous. The humiliation had tipped him over the edge. Just as he raised his hand to strike me, the door to the waiting room swung open. Lysander stood there, pushing Arthur Thorne slowly into the room in his wheelchair. Arthur was very much alive. Julian froze, his hand still raised, his face a grotesque painting of shock, horror and dawning comprehension. He looked from me to Arthur to Lysander and back to me. He had been played. Masterfully. "Grandpa," he stammered, his voice a broken thing. "Aren't you supposed to be dead?" Arthur's presence filled the room, an undeniable authority that made the air feel thick. He looked older, frilier, but his eyes were sharp and clear, burning with a cold fire. "Sorry to disappoint you," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Julian immediately began to backpedal. I didn't mean. As long as you're healthy, that's all that matters to the family. I'm not disappointed at all. Really, I'm happy." Arthur wasn't in the mood for lies. "I know everyone's been eyeing my inheritance," he said, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "So, to put your minds at ease, I've already finalized my will. It's in the hands of my personal attorney." He paused, his gaze sweeping over Julian's terrified face before settling on me. "If anything happens to me, Elara Sterling will be the sole heir of the Thorn Corporation." The words landed like a thunderclap. I was as shocked as Julian looked. I had expected Arthur to disown Julian, to name Lysander as his successor. I never imagined he would bestow it all upon me. Julian looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "As an outsider?" he shrieked, his composure completely gone. "Even if I've made mistakes, Grandpa, you can't just hand over the entire corporation to her." Without a word, Arthur picked up his heavy, oak cane and whacked Julian squarely across the back. The sound was a sickening thud. In my eyes, Arthur said, his voice stern and unforgiving, you are the outsider. You may carry my blood, but what good has it done? Your respect was never for me. It was for my money. If I were just an old man picking trash off the street, would you take care of me? He glared at his grandson, all pretense of affection gone. I'm not even dead yet, and all you can think about is how to divide my assets. You even tried to coerce Emma into lying for you. Everyone can see right through your scheming. The truth was out. The room had been under surveillance. Julian's every word, his every groveling plea had been recorded. He had been caught in his own greed, and there was no way out. He panicked, shaking his head furiously. It's all a misunderstanding. I didn't mean any of it. But Arthur was done. He was a man who had built an empire on ruthless decisions, and he wasn't about to go soft on his own bloodline now. Without another word, he reassigned Julian to a remote, failing division of the company in a desolate part of Eastern Europe, effectively exiling him and cutting him off from the core business forever. As the security team dragged him away, Julian didn't drop the act. He looked at me with soft, lingering eyes, trying to squeeze out one last performance. Ilara, he said solemnly, I don't know how long I'll be gone this time. Please take care of yourself. There's no one else in this world I care about, just you. Even if we're worlds apart, as long as you're happy, I'll be content. I burst out laughing. The sound was harsh and loud in the tense room. You can cut the act, Julian. That whole hopelessly devoted thing might work on someone else, but for me it's nauseating. I took a step closer, my voice dropping to a whisper only he could hear. You don't love me. If you did, then why, when the plane was going down in our last life, was your first reaction not fear but to beg me to let Isabel go? You blamed me for tearing you apart and begged me never to appear in your next life. His pupils dilated in stunned horror. He hadn't expected me to remember that specific damning detail. That's right, I said calmly. I was reborn. This time I'm letting you go. But too bad. Isabel doesn't love you. I've been thinking about this my whole life, but it ends here. The Thorn Corporation is too big and you're simply not capable. Just go to Eastern Europe and settle there. At least that outcome is much better than the one you had planned for me. He fell silent, the fight finally gone out of him. He had believed his memories gave him an edge, but they had only sealed his fate. He was led away, a broken man, his future as bleak as the Siberian tundra he was being sent to. It was over. Truly over. I turned to face Arthur and Lysander. Arthur's expression was unreadable, but Lysander was looking at me with a strange, new respect. And something else, something warmer that made my breath catch. The king was dead. Long live the queen. The silence that settled after Julian's exile was profound. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the last shot has been fired, the smoke slowly clearing to reveal the victors. I stood in that hospital waiting room, the taste of victory sharp and metallic on my tongue, but it was laced with a strange, hollow ache. The great driving purpose of my second life, surviving Julian and Isabel, was complete. What was left? Arthur Thorne broke the silence. He gestured for me to come closer. His hand, gnarled with age, reached out and took mine. His grip was surprisingly strong. You have your grandmother's fire, he said, his voice raspy but firm. And her cunning. She would have liked you a great deal. He looked over at Lysander, who stood silently by the door, a watchful sentinel. The corporation is in good hands. Both of yours. He didn't say another word about his will, about naming me his sole heir. It was a done deal. The ultimate act of trust, and the ultimate punishment for his own bloodline. He was entrusting his life's work to the ghost of his wife and the son he had never known how to love. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into the work of consolidating power. With Arthur's blessing and Lysander's unwavering support, the transition was smoother than anyone could have anticipated. The shareholders, tired of Julian's dramatics and impressed by Lysander's quiet competence, and my own ruthless effectiveness, fell into line. Lysander and I became the undisputed rulers of the Thorn-Sterling Empire. We were a formidable team. His cold, analytical brilliance complemented my intuitive, aggressive strategy. We spent our days in a whirlwind of meetings, negotiations, and corporate maneuvering. Our nights were spent in the quiet of our penthouse, debriefing, planning, and living. The dynamic between us had deepened into something I no longer had a name for. It wasn't the cold contract we had started with. Nor was it the frantic possessive heat of that night in his study. It was a steady, burning ember of mutual respect, shared ambition, and a companionship I had never known was possible. He was my partner in every sense of the word. One evening I found him in his study, staring at an old, faded photograph on his desk. It was a picture of a beautiful young woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a smile that was both kind and mischievous. My grandmother. He never looked at me, Lysander said quietly without turning around. He knew I was there. He always knew. Not really. All he could see was her. And that I was the reason she was gone. I came to stand beside him, placing a hand on his arm. It wasn't your fault. I know, he said, his voice heavy. But knowing and feeling are two different things. It was the most vulnerable I had ever seen him. The great Lysander Thorne, laid bare by a lifetime of paternal neglect. In that moment I made it my mission to heal the rift that had defined his life. I began orchestrating casual encounters between father and son. I would bring documents for Arthur to sign when Lysander was present. I arranged family dinners, forcing them into the same room, guiding the conversation towards safe, neutral topics. Business, politics, the latest scientific breakthroughs. At first it was stilted and awkward. Arthur would address his comments to me, and Lysander would retreat into his shell of cold formality. But slowly, painfully slowly, the ice began to crack. Arthur started asking Lysander for his opinion on merger proposals. Lysander, in turn, began to brief his father on his projects without being asked. They discovered a shared, razor-sharp intellect, a similar way of seeing the world. The ghost of my grandmother began to recede, replaced by the living, breathing reality of the son she had left behind. I was the bridge, and with every passing day I watched them cross it, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. Meanwhile, news trickled in from the Eastern European branch. Julian Thorne had fallen ill. The medical facilities were subpar, his spirit broken. His condition worsened rapidly, and within a month he was dead. I felt nothing. No triumph, no sorrow. It was as if a character from a particularly unpleasant book had finally met his end. The chapter was closed. The story could move on. With the external threats neutralized and the internal family dynamics healing, Arthur Thorne officially retired. He transferred all his shares to me as promised. The announcement caused a global media frenzy. Ilara Sterling was now the primary shareholder and de facto ruler of Thorne Global, on top of my own Sterling Corporation. I was catapulted onto the world stage as one of the richest and most powerful people on the planet. The attention was relentless. Magazines clamored for interviews, labeling me everything from the ice queen of industry to a modern-day pharaoh. Through it all, Lysander was my rock. He handled the increased security, filtered the endless requests, and was my sanctuary from the storm. One night, after a particularly grueling day of back-to-back interviews, I collapsed onto the sofa in our living room, exhausted. I think I preferred being pushed out of a plane, I groaned, only half joking. It was quicker. Lysander didn't laugh. He came and sat beside me, his expression serious. He took my hand, his thumb stroking my palm. "You never talk about it," he said softly. "The plane. You said it once, that first time we met to discuss our arrangement. You said you needed a husband who wouldn't push you out of a plane. I never asked. I thought it was just a metaphor." I went very still. The old defenses slammed into place. It was the one secret I had kept from him, the core of my being in this second life. To speak it aloud felt like risking everything. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw no judgment, only a deep, unwavering concern. He had laid his vulnerability bare for me. Could I not do the same? I took a shaky breath. "It wasn't a metaphor," I whispered, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. "In another life, a life that feels more real than this one sometimes, Julian was my husband for 15 years. On our anniversary, our plane went down. And in that moment he threw my parachute away. He told me I finally understood what despair was. And then he pushed me." The words hung in the air, a confession so fantastical it defied belief. I waited for his skepticism, his disbelief, his pity. None came. He simply listened, his gaze never leaving mine, his hand holding mine tightly. "I died," I finished, my voice barely a whisper. And then I woke up at that engagement banquet. There was a long, heavy silence. He was processing, weighing the impossible truth of my words. "So, he said finally, his voice low and incredibly gentle. That's where the fire comes from. That's the weight you've been carrying. Tears I didn't know I had in me welled up in my eyes. He believed me. He didn't question it. He simply accepted it as a part of me. All this time, he murmured, pulling me into his arms. All this time you've been fighting a war no one else could see. I buried my face in his chest, finally allowing myself to let go, to release the terror and the loneliness I had carried for what felt like an eternity. He held me, his embrace a fortress against the ghosts of my past. You're safe now, Ilara, he whispered into my hair. I have you. I will always have you. And for the first time since I had fallen from the sky, I truly, completely believed it. The war was over. I had not only won the empire, but I had, against all odds, found a king worthy of ruling it by my side. Peace is a strange commodity. After a lifetime of struggle, first in poverty, then in a gilded cage, and finally in a high-stakes war for survival, it felt alien, like a suit that didn't quite fit. But as the months turned into a year, I began to grow into it. With Julian and Isabel gone and the Thorn Empire securely in our hands, Lysander and I were free to build rather than to battle. We merged Sterling Corp and Thorn Global into a single terrifyingly efficient entity, Sterling Thorn Holdings. We became a force for innovation, pouring resources into green technology and medical research. Our combined intellect and ruthlessness used for something that felt, if not noble, then at least productive. My relationship with Arthur Thorn deepened into a genuine affection. Freed from the burdens of leadership and the grief that had haunted him, he became the grandfather I had never had. He doted on me, his love for his late wife finally transforming into a pure, proud love for the woman he saw as her legacy. He and Lysander developed a quiet, respectful bond. It would never be a traditionally warm father-son relationship, but the decades of frost had thawed into a mutual understanding and respect. They played chess every Sunday, their games long, silent affairs that were more about companionship than competition. One Sunday I was watching them from the terrace, the soft click of the pieces the only sound, when Arthur looked up and caught my eye. He gave me a small, rare smile and then looked meaningfully at Lysander. It was a look of approval, of gratitude. I had given him back his son. Lysander, in turn, was a constant, surprising presence. The man I had once thought was a cold, unfeeling machine revealed layers of dry wit, quiet passion, and a steadfast loyalty that became the bedrock of my new life. Our marriage, born from a calculated proposition, had blossomed into the most real thing I had ever known. It was a partnership of equals, a meeting of minds and hearts that I had never dared to dream of. One evening we were reviewing plans for a new corporate headquarters, a soaring glass and steel monument to our joint reign. I was arguing for more green space, he for greater structural efficiency. The debate was lively, intense, and ended with him sweeping the blueprints off the table, pulling me into his arms and kissing me until I forgot what I was arguing about. Later, as we lay tangled together in the dark, he traced the line of my jaw with his finger. You know, he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room, I spent my entire life believing I was meant to be alone. That I was too sharp, too detached for the messiness of love. I had accepted it. I turned to look at him, his features softened in the moonlight. And now, he said, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that still made my heart stutter, I believe I was just waiting for you. A woman sharp enough to match me. Someone who understood that love isn't a weakness but a different kind of strategy. A permanent alliance. Tears pricked at my eyes, but they were tears of joy, a sensation so unfamiliar it felt like a discovery. A permanent alliance, I repeated, the words a vow. He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. The most profitable one I've ever made. The world continued to watch us, of course. The press dubbed us the king and queen of corporate America. We were on the covers of magazines, the subjects of endless speculation. But the noise outside no longer mattered. We had built our own world, a fortress of our own making. One afternoon I was working in my office when a news alert flashed on my screen. Isabel Chin had been found dead in a squalid apartment in a city far from here. The report said it was a drug overdose. A tragic, lonely end for a woman who had once been the darling of high society. I felt a pang not of grief but of a profound, weary sadness. She had been a product of her upbringing, a girl taught to value luxury and status above all else. When that was taken away, she had nothing left to sustain her. Her story was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the hollowness of the world I had fought so hard to conquer. I closed the news feed and looked out over the city skyline. The empire Lysander and I now commanded sprawling beneath me. I had everything I had never known I wanted. Power, respect, and a love that was as solid and unyielding as diamond. I thought of the woman I had been, hurtling towards the earth, believing her life had been a meaningless, painful mistake. I thought of the cold despair in Julian's voice. Now you know what true despair feels like. He was wrong. Despair was being pushed out of a plane by the man you'd shared your life with. Hope was being granted a second chance. But happiness was building a new life from the ashes of the old, not with a spirit of vengeance, but with a heart finally open to peace. I felt a pair of strong arms wrap around me from behind, and Lysander rested his chin on my shoulder, following my gaze out over the city. "Everything all right?" he murmured. I leaned back into his embrace, the last of the ghosts finally settling. "Everything is perfect," I said, and for the first time I meant it with every fiber of my being. The fall had not been my end. It had been my beginning. And this time the landing was soft and I was not alone. The end.